Hello, my name is Lloyd F. Reese. I'm your host, and I'd like to welcome you to Black Perspectives. The topic of our show today is politics. Where do we go from here? We're on location in downtown Los Angeles at City Hall East. Our guest, a lifelong civil rights crusader who has established herself not only in city government, but the community as well. And at this time, I'd like to welcome the 9th District City Council member, Rita Walters. Mrs. Walters, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Mrs. Walters, you made political history nearly 10 years ago by becoming the first African American woman to be elected to the Los Angeles City Council. Nearly 30 years after your predecessor, Gilbert W. Lindsay, was appointed in 1963. How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel very good about it. Gilbert Lindsay was appointed in '63, but Tom Bradley was the first African American elected to the City Council here in Los Angeles. And then I followed along as the first African American female to be elected to that position.
Mrs. Walters, let's go back in time to 1955. It's been almost 50 years since the beginning of the mass exodus of African Americans out of the South in search of the Promised Land. Now, this is where your legacy in Los Angeles begins, in the City of Angels. The same year that you migrated to Los Angeles, we had the civil rights movement that began in the South. 1 year earlier, we had the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling that came out. And nearly a decade prior to that, we had the restrictive covenants that were placed on minorities in LA were declared unconstitutional. Times were changing for African Americans across the country, and you became a very important figure in those changes in Los Angeles. You first came here from Kansas in 1955.
That's right.
Were you originally from Kansas, Mrs. Walters?
Yes, Kansas was my home. I was
Oh.
born in Illinois, grew up in Kansas, where my parents were born, and then came here.
Now, how was Los Angeles different from Kansas?
Oh, there's no comparison, really. Kansas is a small state with a collection of small cities and towns. I lived in Kansas City, Kansas, which was, at that time, the second largest. For many years as I grew up, it was the first largest, but then Wichita overtook Kansas City, Kansas. Kansas was a free state, as was California.
Yes.
But it was a borderline state. It bordered Missouri, which was a slave state. And of course, our history tells us that the Underground Railroad ran right up to St. Joseph, Missouri, north of Kansas City. And many slaves escaped across the river into Kansas and then made their way to points in Kansas and further west.
So Kansas, more or less, was almost like an underground railroad for African Americans.
Well, it was part of the Underground Railroad, and of course John Brown. It was a hotbed of abolitionists in Kansas.
While we're speaking, this is Black History Month, and let me wish you a wonderful Black History Month.
Well, thank you very much.
Now, when you first came to Los Angeles, what was your profession?
I came here, I was a clerical worker, an office worker. My first job here was at the county hospital in the psychiatric department. They had a court there where they committed patients, heard patients' cases, and they had the court right there in the building so they wouldn't have to transport people whose behavior was erratic, to say the least.
What were your thoughts and feelings about the Brown versus Board of Education decision?
Well, coming from a segregated environment, even though Kansas was a free state, the schools everywhere in Kansas, except Kansas City, Kansas, were segregated at the elementary level, and then because the towns were so small, everybody went to the same high school. And the case in Brown, Topeka, Kansas, which involved Topeka, Kansas, was about the daughter of Mr. Brown, Linda Brown, having to walk past an all-white elementary school to get to the all-black elementary school. And that was the basis of the suit from Topeka, Kansas. And of course, I had that same experience as a child, walking past a white elementary school to get to a black elementary school.
Even though Kansas wasn't a slave state, were African Americans, did they have freedom, Mrs. Walters?
Well, the schools were, in Kansas City, Kansas, schools
Right.
were segregated from kindergarten through high school and junior college. You could go to the University of Kansas or Kansas State College. You could be admitted there with no problem. There are no barriers there if you had the grades to do it. You couldn't eat in the restaurants. The very first job I had was as a soda jerk at a 5 and dime. And we waited on all the people, but the white people had the counter here, and black people had the counter in the back. And they couldn't sit together. There was a space of about 1 seat between them. Definitely segregated.
Now, the year that you came to Los Angeles, the Civil Rights Movement had started in the South. What were your feelings and thoughts about the Civil Rights Movement?
Well, I came here in January '55, and the bus boycott started. I guess it had started before then. I went to school in Alabama, northern Alabama, in Huntsville.
Yes.
So I had been to Montgomery. I knew that church well. And, you know, it just made you want to stand up and shout when the people took the action that they took.
Now, how did the people in Los Angeles react to the Civil Rights Movement in the very beginning, when you first arrived here? I mean, as the months went on and the movement got started.
Well, there were many people who had come from the South who no doubt felt the same way I did, and wanted to be very supportive of what was going on.
So you would say that people felt the change coming on, and they all wanted to be a part of it.
Right, and of course people felt that there was an idea that California was sort of, particularly Los Angeles, was sort of the land of milk and honey. But once you got here, you understood that that wasn't the case.
Even though California was supposed to be a much better place for African Americans to prosper, but yet and still, we still had somewhat Jim Crow system. We still had the separate but equal.
When California was founded,
Right.
44 people put it together.
Right.
Almost half of those were black descent, of African descent.
Right, right. Now, Mrs. Walters, I want to ask you about a person I know that is very, very dear and close to you. How important was Julian Dickson to the African American involvement in politics in Los Angeles?
Oh, Julian was so very, very important to him, because Julian was a master at bringing people together, at opening dialogue with other groups, and because of that, he was able to get his legislation through, and speak to the needs of not only the African American community, but Los Angeles, period. Julian was really the person to go to in Washington for money for the subway and the blue line and the green line. Julian was very instrumental in that. He sat on the appropriations committee and had access to funds so that he could secure, and he secured those funds for the betterment of Los Angeles. So much he did for the city, for the schools, for businesses, for all layers of government here in the city. He was a master politician and a person of whom to be very, very proud.
Mrs. Walters, who would you say are the politicians that paved the way for you?
All of them who've gone before. We all stand on many, many shoulders to get where we are. So that first person in 1918 that got elected to the city council, and Gus Hawkins, and all who came subsequent to that, Byron Rumford, and many, many others. Those are shoulders that I stood and who helped me. And more than that, there were shoulders of all the black people. Kitty Mason, who struggled to get here in the first place and was very entrepreneurial once she got here. The teachers that I had in school that cautioned, be prepared for what we don't know, but be prepared. Get all the education you can get so that you can be prepared. I never in life thought that elective office would be a career option for me.
Were you surprised at the changes socially and politically and economically that African Americans had in city government once they became involved on a much larger scale?
Well, it wasn't just a matter of becoming involved in a larger scale. The laws of the land changed, and just like the Plessy case in 1898 was a railroad case about where Plessy was going to sit. He was a freedman, as they called him. He was no longer a slave. And they wanted him to move to a segregated car, and he wouldn't move. And the Supreme Court said that as long as it's separate but equal, that's where that doctrine came from. But then people applied it to mean that the theaters were separate, the restaurants were separate, some stores were separate, you couldn't try on goods in the stores and all of that. All of those things flowed from Plessy. And once that was struck down with the 54 school desegregation decision, many other things dropped. The barriers dropped in many other areas as well. And not only the politics in terms of people getting elected to office, but the one-man, one-vote decision, I think was in 1961. They had to redistrict in a fair way so that blacks could, and other minorities, could have the opportunity to get elected.
Mrs. Walters, were you ever involved in teaching?
Yes, I was. I taught for 4 years, English as a second language to adults.
Now, how did you get from teaching to the Board of Education?
I was at the Board of Education first as a parent who was in school from the time my first son went to school in 1961 until the time all three of my kids graduated from the school district. By that time, I was on the school board.
Was the school board instrumental in implementing the African American curriculum in Los Angeles Unified School District?
There is no the African American curriculum.
Okay.
But along with other people, I pushed for an inclusion of the history of all people in the curriculum, and certainly the history of African American people.
Mrs. Walters, what year did they start teaching African American studies in the school system?
A lot depended on the teachers that you had, the interest of the teachers, or the interest of the principal, and whether the principal could get teachers who were interested in teaching that. It was never full-blown, across-the-board, mandated as such or followed up, but I would say in the 60s, probably 65 to about 70, 71, somewhere along there, those were probably the best years for it.
Now, Mrs. Walters, why do you feel that it took so many years for us to find our place in the city and
I don't
city
think
council?
we have a place. Our place is wherever we wish to go.
Yes.
And whatever we aspire to. There's no such notion as a certain place for anybody.
Now, you're completing your second term in office. What are your plans after you're done with the city council work?
I think it's time for me to do some volunteer work and to do some other things that I haven't had the time to do while I've been in elected office.
Now, while you've been an elected official, you've been involved in a lot of projects that involve the diverse communities in which your district oversees. Tell us about the 9th District Shuttle service.
Well, there's a portion of the 9th District. We have one public housing project in the 9th District. It's on the middle by Long Beach Boulevard. An elementary school on one side of Long Beach Boulevard with kids over there, but also kids on the west side of Long Beach Boulevard. And these railroad tracks going down the middle, the kids have to get back and forth, and parents, there's a little store over here on the west side, and there are things on the east side. There's a little recreation center on the east side. And people going back and forth, and the blue line came and made it even worse than the railroad. People have to stand out there and literally wait until these trains pass before they could cross over, and had to walk long distances. So line without building a bridge over the tracks.
Mm-hmm.
So we got them to put a dash bus free of charge, so to act as a shuttle back and forth across those tracks and through the neighborhoods. Now, fortunately, just a few weeks ago, we broke ground for that bridge. There's a bridge going up, but in all these years, there have been a couple of deaths on those tracks. And the last one was a 12-year-old boy to whom we're dedicating the bridge.
Oh, wow. Now, Mrs. Walters, you're the chairman and the vice chairman of several committees. Can you share with our viewers what those committees are and what they stand for?
Each council member belongs to 3 committees. One is a chair, second one is a vice chair, and third is a member. I'm chair of the Arts, Health, and Humanities Committee, vice chair of Budget and Finance, and a member of Public Works.
Now, speaking of the West Coast Renaissance and Central Avenue, as far as remaining buildings that we have that even show us any remnants of that time in the past, we have the Dunbar Hotel and the African American Firefighters Museum. Now, you had a lot to do with both those facilities. Am I not mistaken, Mrs. Walters?
Right. We were able to secure the funds for the renovation of Fire Station 30, which is now African American Firefighters Museum. But it was the station where any black hired for years and years as a firefighter had to work out of Station 30. He was not allowed to go work in a station where white firefighters were. And then after that, after it was Fire Station 30, that's about 14th and Central.
Yes.
They did Fire Station 14, which is down at about Jefferson.
Are you and the rookie Arnett Hartsfield very close, Mrs. Walters?
Oh, I've known Arnett for many, many years. He's one of the wonderful people that I met during the 60s, during the push here for black representation in elective bodies. He ran for the school board, and I supported him twice for that. But Arnett was first and foremost always fighting for the firemen of the LA Fire Department, fighting for the black firemen.
Now, Mrs. Walters, where do you think politics is going now with the African Americans in the city of Los Angeles?
Well, I think it will go where we decide that we want to go. And that's going to have to be coalition politics. We've got, we don't have these enclaves of, and shouldn't have enclaves of only certain folks. I think this city is full of its diversity. We talk a lot about the diversity, but we don't build on it. And I think now is the time to build on it, to build bridges to other communities. And bridges have to be two-way streets. So we have to give a little, we have to take a little, and meet there in the middle to make life better for all of us.
Now, in the past, we had coalition politics in the past once before, and you would like to see it come back to that? Is that what you're saying, Mrs. Walters?
Tom Bradley was very good at coalition politics, and so is Julian Dickson. And we have to take lessons from both of those gentlemen who we can say were our contemporaries, and move forward.
Our black population in Los Angeles is starting to migrate out of Los Angeles, and we've got a vast rainbow of culture, of other cultures coming in. Where do you think that the blacks are going, Mrs. Walters?
Where they want to go. And that was the point of fair housing, so that people could buy a home wherever their money took them, or wherever they determined that that was a place they wanted to live, whether they wanted to buy it or whether they wanted to rent it.
You feel that Black History having a month, do you feel that why are we just limited to just a month? Why can't we have Black history every day? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the history and struggles and problems of all people should be taught as one history, the story of mankind. We have history texts called the story of mankind, but it's all predominantly an Anglo history. We really must integrate our textbooks. And we had a African American school superintendent for many years, Wilson Riles, who did his best to get that job done. And there were laws passed at the state level. But I think people have sort of laid those things aside now.
Do you think Dr. King would be happy to see the divergence of cultures learning together and growing together?
He would, if we were doing that. There's so many places where we aren't doing that. I think the schools, there are more segregated schools in Los Angeles now than there were in 1955.
Mrs. Walters, it's an absolute pleasure. I understand how busy you are, and I want to thank you for taking the time to come on Black Perspectives. Our platform is to bring public awareness to the rainbow of cultures here in Los Angeles that are familiar with the past and present experiences of African Americans here in Los Angeles. And what we try to do here at Black Perspectives is to enlighten those people. Our hat goes off to individuals like yourself for giving us the opportunity to come into your daily life and to spend a few moments with you. It's a wonderful thing. And at this time, I just want to thank you so much for spending time with me, ma'am. It's
My
been a
pleasure.
Thank
My
you, Mrs.
pleasure.
Walters. Thank
Okay. All right. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.